Good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for being in this very cold room with us today. I was just saying I'd lost some sensation to my nose 5 minutes in, so we'll see how we go. But again, thank you so much for being here and spending time with us today and engaging in such an important and critical topic. So just before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this event is taking place on traditional Ohlone land, and we recognise its continued importance to the Ohlone people. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So, the right to the city. This has been an ongoing source of contention and struggle for multiple groups and identities that are excluded from everyday spaces. So indeed, our ability to access, use and engage with public spaces is a significant indicator and resource of our social power and belonging. So although our access to public spaces should be and is an individual freedom, we know that this freedom is not afforded to all. Racialized groups are aware of where they do or do not belong, where they are welcome or where they are not, and most concerning, they learn to map where they are safe or unsafe. Now, this could be from everyday racist verbal abuse from fellow citizens or from state violence, but this makes simple spatial activities like walking down the street, driving while black, or flying while Muslim a potentially humiliating or a life-threatening activity in an everyday space. So what it does is it just creates everyday spaces that become geographies of risk. Now, this session engages in how racism and structural violence undermines the way targeted minorities exercise their right to the city. And in this, the freedom to belong in the public space and navigate these spaces freely and openly. So together, our panelists, our panel of experts, will draw our attention to the role of our public spaces in either reproducing or resisting broader global and national messages of racial discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion. So in connecting race and place, we can gain a deeper understanding of how racism affects the daily lives of targeted minorities. And most importantly, we will together try to discuss and identify the strategies that are required for cultivating inclusive localities and starting to bridge belonging across everyday spaces. So my name is Rhonda Itaoui. I am a PhD candidate at the Western Sydney University School of Social Sciences and Psychology and a former research fellow at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. My work looks specifically at the geographies of Islamophobia. And this work grew organically through my experience growing up Muslim in a post-9/11 Australia, where I started to see this shift in perceptions towards my family, towards the people that I cared about most, and realising that our identities were not going to fly under the radar or be accepted as Australian as they had been when I was at a younger age. So I grew into my adolescence and adulthood under an increasingly scrutinised identity and a demonised and criminalised identity, and started to wonder and navigate the way that my community was internalising and reproducing these messages of exclusion, namely the way that they were internalising their mosques being opposed, their sites of worship or schools being opposed from being developed, and how young Muslims like myself were engaging in those spaces that they had been excluded from. So this has inspired a lot of the concepts that we are looking at in the panel today, and I'm very excited to hear from our panelists and the work that they are engaging in. So we will hear some very short 8-minute presentations from each of our panelists, and then I will address the panel with a 30-minute window where we will discuss a few key questions that relate to the questions over on the slide. And then we will open the floor for around 20 minutes where you can engage with our panelists on the issues that they've addressed as well. So hopefully we'll be addressing some of the questions when I ask them in the first place. So we will start off with Professor Kevin Dunn and progress through to Lara Kiswani, then Omar Salha and Roberto Zurbano, who come with a breadth of experience from different contexts around the world, including local experience here as well. So we'll start off today hearing from Professor Kevin Dunn, who is the Professor of Human Geography and Dean of the School of Social Sciences and Psychology at Western Sydney University. He's been among notable scholars researching the geographies of racism in Australia, inspired my work on the geographies of Islamophobia personally. And most notably, he's the lead investigator on the Challenging Racism Project, which is a national project in Australia documenting and countering racism across the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. Bujari Mula Nawal Warami. I say good morning to you and welcome in the language of the Darug, who are the traditional owners of the lands where I come from in Western Sydney in Australia, and I pay deep respect to them for the gift that is those lands where I live and where I work. And I acknowledge the Ohlone people too, the traditional custodians of these lands. I've just yesterday come from Washington DC, where I was at the annual conference of the American Geographers Association, where we participated, my colleagues and I, in the Challenging Racism Project on a session of papers on the geographies of Islamophobia, but also on political mobilisation against Islamophobia across the world, as we've perceived it as geographers. So the papers weren't just about Islamophobia, but they were also about how to confront that. And that was a fantastic preparation for coming here today and to this conference. It's the first time I've attended an Othering Belonging conference, which is a great conference for its focus not just on othering, but also on belonging, but ultimately too with this mission of bridging. So I might just get hold of that clicker there, Rhonda, if that's okay. So I can forward my slides. Thank you very much. My theme is Islamophobia as a version of racism in this paper today. I see it as a social malady. I see it as a national calamity in Australia. One of my colleagues, Professor Linda Briskman, describes Islamophobia, particularly in the context of Australia, as a creeping blight. And I think it's an evocative and useful way to describe this new and emerging worsening form of racism in Australia, because it's not just describing its expansion, but it's also its creep and expansion through the different social sectors of Australian society as well. Research reports on the extent of Islamophobia in countries like Australia, and not just Australia of course, show that too many people have negative views about Muslims these days. And as I say, that's not unusual now in Western nations. But one of the things I want to assert today is that Islamophobia is socially and spatially varied. It is not homogenised nor universal. And it's my belief that those are important things for us to bear in mind when we contemplate the action that we should take against it if we are to expand the rights to the city of minority groups, such as Muslim Australians. Islamophobia is associated with organised racist groups in Australia. It's both a characteristic of their thinking, but also a political tool for them. It is a means by which the white supremacist movements in Australia have begun to crystallise their community and build community around anti-Muslim sentiment. But it has extended far beyond those political extremes. Creeping blight metaphor grasps the way in which these trends are now extending towards what we might call mainstream Australians. Of course, 1 in 10 Australians have deeply supremacist views, and we would expect them to be dyed-in-the-wool Islamophobes, and they are the people who use Islamophobia for political gain. We would expect them to have that antipathy. But associating Islamophobia only with the right wing and the white supremacist groups would be a mistake. And the critical race theorists in Australia remind us that we shouldn't let the mainstream off the hook. A focus only on white supremacists as a deviant minority would allow mainstream Islamophobia to escape our critical attention. As many as half the Australian population say they have negative views about Muslims. When asked, how would you feel about being in proximity to a Muslim? As I say, about half of Australians say they would be concerned in some way, would be concerned if a close relative were to marry someone of Muslim faith. So Islamophobia has become ambient. But that does not mean that the nature of Islamophobia is the same across those social groups, as defined by their demography or by their attitudes to diversity and difference. The remedies and the means to challenge Islamophobia will be different in different parts of society and across space. Islamophobia of those who are unsettled about diversity will be different from the Islamophobia of the white supremacists, and will be different from the Islamophobia of those who are otherwise comfortable with diversity. Many years ago, I mapped the geography of racism in Australia and continue to do so. Here's two maps that show the geography of anti-Muslim sentiment and the anti-Asian sentiment in the city of Sydney. We don't have to spend too much time on this other than to say that the maps are different. The variations in intolerance, these two forms of intolerance, are different. And a major finding of our project over the years in Australia has been that racism is everywhere, but everywhere different. So the spatial variations in Islamophobia are linked to variations in attitudes of non-Muslims, that's a given, but also the Islamophobic effect is strongest if it's perceived that Islamophobia is strong in a particular part of the city. In other words, if a place is seen by Muslims as inhabited by Islamophobes, then Muslims will avoid those places. Similarly, if a space is perceived as Islamophobic by Islamophobes, then they will feel comfortable saying and doing Islamophobic things in that place. Rhonda's work, as she's made reference to in the Bay Area here in California, but also in Sydney, Australia, shows the distinct geographies to the perception of Islamophobia. Places like Cronulla are seen as Islamophobic, and that's linked to an anti-Muslim violence that occurred there in 2005, 14 years ago. Still to this day, young Australian Muslims perceive it as an unsafe space. Their rights to the city have been curtailed, and Rhonda has found the same for the north and outer eastern Bay regions of the Bay Area. Muslim presence in some regions, on the other hand, is associated with safety. Attacks on mosques fundamentally challenge those islands of safety and belonging in cities like Sydney, but elsewhere in the world. The profoundly saddening effect of the terror attack, like those in Christchurch 3 weeks ago, is that those havens of security, those havens away from Islamophobia, are increasingly challenged. Municipal opposition to places of worship, opposition to private schools, also are means to limit Muslims' rights to the city. And as I've written about extensively, oppositions to mosques are overtly statements about who does and does not belong in the nation and within the locality. How am I going for time, Rhonda? 2 minutes. I outlined earlier that racist attitudes are expressed in different regions in often quite specific ways. Place or context matters. And I have this conviction that these local variations in intolerance are essential in any consideration of anti-racism initiatives. The regionally varied nature of racism means that anti-racist initiatives ought to be locally sensitive. Anti-racism needs to be locally owned, locally created as well. Anti-racism needs to be seen to be done well in such places as well, to confront the perception of racism in space and place. If we failed to reduce the perception of a place as Islamophobic, then Muslims' rights to the cities will continue to be curtailed. And that might occur for types of places, like public transport, for instance. The mapping of racism and also Islamophobia, for example, can also identify areas that ought be a focus of state and citywide priorities and action. This will help with the acknowledgement of racism in those areas, which is an essential first step for considering anti-racist initiatives. Ghassan Haj recently made the assertion that should we worry too much about the thinking of racists and telling them that they're wrong? What are our prospects of success of using evidence to confront the inaccuracies of racists where evidence is so shaky in a post-truth world? Well, that may be true. And indeed, curtailment and proscription may be the focus for those Islamophobes that I made reference to before, the 1 in 10 in Australia, for instance. But other people may be unsettled about diversity but have Islamophobic thinking, and they may be people who we precisely need to change the minds of. In fact, they are essential to our mission of convincing and changing the minds of other people in society. They are essential for preventing racist action and racist and Islamophobic statements in the ordinary spaces of our society. And behaviour change through those forms of proscription will be important. I'm convinced that bystander action is an essential political resource in the challenge to Islamophobia in a country like Australia, and I think also in other Western nations. Encouraging people to speak up and speak out when they witness or hear Islamophobic statements is essential. We know from the international literature that only about 80% of people say they would speak up or speak out if they saw someone being discriminated against or if they heard someone say something racist or Islamophobic. About 80%. But we know that only about 30% actually do. People overpromise and underdeliver. It is an untapped political resource. Just flick on a bit because of my time running away from you. Just to the bottom there. We know that when people speak up for their fellow citizens, that this can have a profoundly affirming effect on their sense of citizenship and belonging. It shows them that somebody else values them as a human being, sees them as a member of the community, and values their citizenship. The opposite is also true. To not do anything, to stand by and not take action when you witness an Islamophobic statement or Islamophobic action is to not only is to worsen the morbid effects of the racism itself, but also send a statement about the status of that person in terms of their citizenship and whether or not they're worth fighting for. So, enhancing the minority rights to the city will take more than bridging initiatives. I accept that at the personal and local level. There are those for whom Islamophobia is also a political tool, and prescription and banning and prevention are the tactics that we need for those. But there are others in society who we need to turn around, who we need to move back to the anti-racism cause, to the anti-Islamophobia cause, and to encourage them to upstand, to speak out, and to take local action, and through that to prescribe racism. By generating an intolerance of racism and of Islamophobia, we can change the norms in places, in settings, in publics, and we can expand minority rights to the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So up next, we have Lara Kiswani from the Arab Resource and Organising Centre here in the Bay Area. She's the Executive Director of the Arab Resource and Organising Centre and is from Beit Iksa and Akir, Palestine, hoping I got that right, and was born and raised in the Bay Area. She got her Master's in Education with an emphasis on equity and social justice, where her work focused on young Arab women, language and colonisation. So as a student organiser, she was a co-founder of Students for Justice in Palestine, helped to establish the Middle East South Asia Studies Program and organised with Third World Forum at UC Davis. She has worked as a youth and adult educator and is a lecturer at San Francisco State University in the College of Ethnic Studies. A warm welcome to Lara Kiswani.
Good morning, everybody. How are you guys doing? So I'll be speaking to you as a local organizer, as an internationalist, and as a Palestinian and indigenous activist. So we're here in the San Francisco Bay Area. For those of you who don't get to spend as much time as some of us here, we know that San Francisco has its own particular way in which it is seen as a liberal or progressive space. It has quite a reputation of being inclusive, welcoming. However, we face a very particular kind of othering and exclusion right here, sometimes more blatant, other times more subtle and normalized and interwoven into the fabric of the city and the entire region. So I want to start by taking, for instance, our program, the Arabic Language Pathway Program, introduced at San Francisco Public Schools. So AROC is a local grassroots organization. We provide direct services to working class poor immigrants, and we also organize our community to fight back against the conditions that force people to need those services in the first place: war, militarism, racism, and repression. And one of the issues that was at the core, or the crux of our community's needs and concerns was lack of visibility and inclusion in the city of San Francisco in public schools in particular. So our community organized to get Arabic taught in public schools, something that all of you would probably say, well, what's wrong with Arabic being taught in public schools? If San Francisco is so progressive, what would be a problem with having Arabic as an opportunity for all students to learn from K through 12? And so we worked on that, and we were successful in, I'm going to use this clicker thing, but I don't know if I, oh, that's, yeah. So this is us at the Board of Education fighting for Arabic language pathway, the program, the community mobilizing, saying, yes, we want self-determination in our own schools, having language as an option. And soon after, we faced great backlash and Islamophobic attacks against Arabic being taught in public schools, right? It was seen as a threat to the demographics of the city. People felt that having too many Arabs in a school would change the climate of their public schools. Zionist institutions in particular felt that this was a threat to Jewish students for Arabic to be taught in public schools. And for 3 years, we had to actually fight the racist Islamophobic attacks in order to get Arabic reinstated and back in the school. So although the Board of Education said yes, absolutely yes, we want Arabic and Vietnamese, and this is another example of cross-movement building that I'll be talking about in a second. We fought alongside the Vietnamese community to get Arabic and Vietnamese taught, understanding that we all belonged in the city. It was a growing population, both of which weren't represented in San Francisco public schools. We won the campaign and then faced the backlash and repression because of the ways in which structural violence, structural racism plays out in the daily realities of our experience here in the Bay Area. There was also at the very same time as us fighting for this, Muni and the public, the buses that actually take our children and our families to schools and throughout the city of San Francisco were draped with anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian bus ads, right? So these bus ads were very clearly targeting Arabs and Muslims, saying that Arabs were uncivilized, Muslims were uncivilized. These were paid for by a right-wing Zionist organization, and the city said this is free speech, we can't control it, right? So while they allow these racist bus ads to be draping across the city of San Francisco, they're stopping Arabic and the democratic process by which was passed by the Board of Education to be taught in schools. Another example that I want to talk about is militarization. So according to Ruthie Gilmore, racism is the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death in distinct yet densely interconnected political geographies. Wars, massacres, militarism, racism are daily examples of that type of racism, right? And here in the Bay Area, we see federal policies that are infringing on local laws. So we have the Department of Homeland Security offering millions of dollars to local law enforcement agencies and emergency responders for counterterrorism programs, one of which was called Urban Shield. So Urban Shield looks like this. It's a training that took place every year on the weekend of 9/11, right here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it would bring highly militarized agencies from across the world, including that from apartheid Israel, to train local emergency responders. These exercises took place in public places, including public transportation agencies, the Bay Bridge, San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge, school campuses. It was also a weapons expo that took place right here in the convention center that we are holding this conference at every year since 2007. And it was specifically targeting Arabs and Muslim and black and brown people, and particularly immigrants, as the enemy combatant, the internal enemy that needed to be stifled, that needed to be stopped. And anyone who was engaged in political dissent. So some of the examples they used in terms of training people were protests at the Port of Oakland where unions were fighting for their rights or for rights of other people, or Occupy, for an example. And according to the architects of Urban Shield, wars were no longer only fought against people abroad in countries that the U.S. is occupying or bombing overseas, but must be waged here in the urban centers. And public spaces became a battlefield. So for 7 years, we organized against this training, and we reclaimed space. So what you see here is once we fought in Oakland for the city of Oakland to say hell no to Urban Shield, we won't allow it to be hosted here at the convention center. We successfully pushed it out of this convention center. The next year, they moved it to a more suburban area called Pleasanton, the Pleasanton Fairgrounds. And they thought that they could take it there to a public space, but they wouldn't be interrupted. It would go on as business as usual. So we actually locked down the Pleasanton Fairgrounds, all the gates, one of the most highly militarized programs in the entire world that took place every year here in the Bay Area with law enforcement agencies from across the world, including law enforcement agencies here. The community, the grassroots coalition, Stop Urban Shield Coalition, shut down the Pleasanton Fairgrounds to reclaim public space for what we believe it really should be about, right? And we demanded that we end the militarization. And we won. So after 6 years, as of this year, Urban Shield no longer exists. And Urban Shield... And while this is a great success, I'll talk about some of the takeaways. We should also understand the impact of these types of programs and the ways in which they shift our perception of belonging, who is and isn't othered, who does or doesn't, should or shouldn't be excluded, right? And the criminalization of black and brown people in particular. That's what we understood Urban Shield was really about. And using the war on terror and the criminalization of Muslims to further justify the ongoing criminalization and violence against other black and brown people. We saw it as one and the same, right? And connecting the dots. It also created a culture of paranoia and a sense of distrust and unsafety. And it also made it so that daily realities of our experience with law enforcement, emergency responders was a reflection of that type of militarized exercises. We became at war, right, with the state locally. So in terms of how we understand public space and how we can actually transform it into a place of resistance, I would argue not every public space has the potential to provide sanctuary. Not every public space can be transformed. We don't understand necessarily detention centers, prisons, police departments as places that we ourselves can reclaim, right? So there are some public spaces that have their limitations, but on the other hand, whether it's public parks and how they're highly surveilled, or the San Francisco International Airport and how it's highly policed, the sense of belonging is less about the actual place, the physical space, but how we reclaim it. And so I want to give some examples of local organizing. So I talked about Stop Urban Shield and how we reclaimed Alameda County as a whole and really fought against internationalism. And now I want to talk a little bit about an example that many of you probably took part in, which are the shutdowns of international airports across the country in response to the Muslim ban. How many of you partook in any of those protests? And so imagine a federal territory, right? So when we shut down SFO International Airport, many of us thought, okay, we have to be careful with who shuts it down, who's putting their lives on the line. And ultimately, everyone shut down International Airport, undocumented, people targeted directly by the Muslim ban, black and brown communities. Everyone decided to come together collectively and exert self-determination in a way we haven't seen before. And so I really believe the SFO International Airport shutdown in particular, and the way we were able to reclaim that space, as for many of us who walk into airports and feel very unsafe on a regular basis, it was a very different experience walking into that airport for those 48 hours, right? We reclaimed that airport. We took care of each other. We did not rely on law enforcement. We made sure that we were protecting each other from those agencies that were tasked with enforcing racist laws, and we were able to free our people, right? So we got them out of the airport free and reunited with their families. And then obviously there's lessons learned about what did or didn't work, what's possible moving forward from these types of actions that took place across the world and across the country. But really what should take away is the fact that when we understand cross-movement building as a strategy of belonging, when we understand cross-movement building as a way to really mitigate against the othering of people, that provides us with a lot of potential, and it provides us with alternative realities and alternative ways of understanding the world. But also that we have to understand there needs to be a legislative strategy and a grassroots strategy, and they must work hand in hand. We can't depend on the courts, and we can't also just depend on the streets. We have to have long-term vision for strategic wins and ways to chip away at the state's ability to continue to reinforce and reproduce structures of violence. And lastly, I want to use one example for us to leave here thinking about in terms of how we can reorient ourselves and understanding belonging and othering in public spaces in this political moment. Today is the 71st year commemoration of the Deir Yassin massacre in Palestine, a small village outside of Jerusalem. This was before the State of Israel was even created. A village of about 750 people faced 200 people were killed and massacred, and it became an early sign for the depopulation, the calculated depopulation of Palestinians in occupied Palestine. It has become one of the most historic moments in our struggle as Palestinians. Now, I name that because as we think about today in this political moment and what's happening across the world, and how Palestine is being othered on a national level, and we think about Congress and Ilhan Omar and others who are being criminalized for simply mentioning the word Palestine, or boycott, divest, and sanctioning Israel, let us wonder and let's question, right? Who is or isn't being excluded in this political moment on a national level in our own Congress? Who is or isn't being excluded on campuses when BDS is being criminalized? And why is that? And so what role does that play for us as internationalists if we want to understand an alternative reality of way of belonging, if we can actually chip away at relationships of state power that are implicating all of us in a way that will harm our future realities for a real place of self-determination, of freedom and belonging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara. Lara was a key access point for me in a way of engaging with the Muslim community when I did my own fieldwork. So it's just so great to hear from you and hear about the amazing work that you've been doing. Next up, we have Omar Salha, who is a PhD Nuhud scholar at SOAS University of London, teaching and research fellow at the Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy, and founder and CEO of the Ramadan Tent Project. Omar is a lecturer in international diplomacy, and his research interests include innovations of soft power, reorientalism, decoloniality, integration and identity politics, Islamophobia, sport diplomacy, public diplomacy, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He is a faculty member for the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at UC Berkeley, and is an appointed fellow at the Royal Society of Arts in London, RSA. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. I want to first of all say, salam alaikum. Peace and blessings be upon you all. I want to thank the Haas Institute for inviting me over to be with you all today and during this very, very important conversation about belonging. I wanted to start off by reflecting about the idea that we're all human creatures. It's in our innate DNA that we are here to understand, to communicate, to live with one another, right? And there's a verse in the Holy Quran which I take inspiration from, and my basis really for much of the work that I'm involved in, which focuses on that when God speaks to people, right? Not to Muslims, but to people. And he says that we created you from a single man and a single woman, and the purpose is that you should recognize one another. We created you into different tribes and nations, that you should recognize one another. And the key operative word here is recognize, right? Not to know, but to recognize. And a lot of the conversation that Professor John Powell spoke about this morning, the key word again is about acknowledging one another, irrespective of our differences and where we come from. And that's very, very powerful message for me. And actually, a lot of the focus that we're talking about today and over the past 3 days is primarily focusing on we are all different in this room, right? And we should all accept our full versions of who we are. And actually accepting that is the first step to truly achieving a sense of belonging, right? Sense of belonging is a feeling, right? There are places which you travel around the globe. Me personally, for example, I've traveled from London. There was a very, very brief moment while I stopped over. I was in JFK, and there was an old uncle in those sort of halal carts around the corner, and he looked at me. And he said, "Salam alaikum," and I was like, "Wa alaikum salam," you know. And then he's like, "Go, so where are you from, etc." That very brief moment, you know, provided me a sense of belonging, right? Irrespective of the fact that it's a city that never sleeps. You know, there are people that are completely glued into their phones, and, you know, rush hour traffic, very different to the lifestyle out here, for example. And for me, and the reason for that is I actually wanted to focus on the fact that we all here, right, carry that sense of belonging inside of us, right? And actually, we shouldn't be solely relying on the infrastructures or the public spaces or private spaces rather, which are actually constructed for us to actually have that feeling of sense of belonging. On the contrary, that is a sense of control, right? When our reliance becomes on spaces, both public and private, for us to actually have this true sense of belonging, then we've given part away of our sovereignty and our agency in who we are, right? And the reason why I mention this is because, some of the stuff that we are involved in, and I'll talk a little bit about more of the grassroots work that we're doing with Ramadan 10 project. And that's primarily focusing on bringing people of all faiths and none to come together to explore what the month of Ramadan is about. We're just under 30 days away from the month of Ramadan, so any people observing that fast, you can share your words of solidarity right now. 16 to 17 hours without food or drink. Yes, not even water. Get asked that question so many times. Proverb, insert. But I want to reflect back to a French philosopher, Henri Lefebvre. And he suggested that a public space is a social product and an arena for the reproduction of social relations, and itself a social relation. So he argued that space continues to be appropriated for purposes of daily life as people live and work in the city from which they have been evicted. So this notion of public space clearly suggests that it is an integral part of the community, right? So the fact that you leave home, go to work, you're in public space. The fact that you step out of this hotel, you're in public space. It surrounds us all. And further to that, Claude Lefort described democratic public space as large enough to accommodate only those who recognize one another within it and who gives it a meaning. And the key word here again is to recognize. Hence a projection towards social stability, a symbolic operation by which concepts are visualized as external realities, and further a rhetorical system for speaking with volume and clarity at a distance. And so the space of art, if we can say, right, this public space involves the work itself, the site, and the viewer, right? If you go to London, if you've been before, the entrance of the Victoria and Albert Museum, there is a quote inscribed which says, "The excellence of every art consists in the accomplishment of its purpose." And if we to see ourselves as art pieces or forms of arts, and are therefore our purpose really on this planet is to be able to live with one another. And actually, I want to make it clear that when we talk about the world that, right now we're in an interconnected world, right? The fact that, I could speak to people in the Middle East through the touch of a button on my phone, Europe, Africa, America, etc., around the globe, right? We're all interconnected with social media, etc. But my question is, how connected are we with one another, right? We're living parallel lives in communities, right? We're living lives within our own communities, be it here locally, nationally, then internationally. And this reflects back to the works of Benedict Anderson when he talks about the imagined community, right? What's interesting here is there are two parallel conversations running here from the nation state and from a local grassroots level when we talk about sense of belonging. The narrative being pushed out from a government level is that we all belong, right? Under this nation, we all are citizens of this nation. It's far from the truth. On the contrary, how many of us, for example, I could say maybe locally, for example, in the UK, people who live in, let's say, Bristol, how much are they connected with the people of Aberdeen or London, for instance? But we still live under this notion that we are all part of one homogeneous group, right? And really, our concern should be focusing on how our version of who we are is not being watered down or being appropriated for a larger conversation. And the key word is for us today, when we walk away with, is being able to appreciate and understand our differences for who they are. And we shouldn't be trying to attempt in any shape, way, or form to try and bring about a sort of change or to try to sort of neutralize any sort of threat or difference that we see in one another, but actually, on the contrary, celebrate those. And what we've done in London, for instance, is in doing that, and of course, we're at a time where anti-Muslim hate crimes are at the highest levels ever in Europe and in the UK, Islamophobia at its highest levels ever recorded. And what we found is that in London, primarily focusing on young people. So 80% of our guests who come and attend these open iftars, we call, are under the age of 35. We have found many young Muslims, both male and female, have a sense of empowerment in their identity and their faith, and in their confidence of their faith, and feeling very open about practicing that in the public, as well as also being mindful that I'm also confident of my citizenship. And what I find quite interesting is when we come to talk about integration vis-a-vis assimilation, the sort of case studies that are celebrated are quite often the ones in which are seen as we will accept, right? It's almost like the James Baldwin example that we heard earlier this morning, right? That is particularly with the British Muslim experience, what we find is those who are sort of watered down versions of their Islam. Actually, we like part of your Islam, but not the whole full concept of Islam, right? Actually, I'm sorry, this is who I am. You have to accept me completely for who I am. Whether you agree with me or disagree, that is not the point. You need to recognize who I am and why. That is the starting point. That is the basis point here. I am certain that I probably disagree with most of you here on many issues, right? But the point is, the starting point is I fully respect and appreciate that we are all different. We have to be. We will be created differently, right? And we take that as a starting point to build alliances, to actually acknowledge that our sense of belonging is in our unity in diversity. That is the most important thing. I'd like to end with a lovely quote who is someone that I personally look up to and is an idol, a leader, a poet, a legend, Muhammad Ali. And the quote is, "Service to others is the rent you pay for your room here on earth," right? And we all in this room here have a duty to do what we can, both on a local, national, and international level, to affect change on a local level. Like I said to you, I mean, most of the people that we've hosted now over 70,000 people across the globe. We've had 10 cities, 4 continents. We're inviting people over food conversations to understand more about our differences and who we are really. And creating that space which is owned by the people who are constructing that narrative which is being spoken about them, which is very important. Quite often we find that the narrative being taught or spoken about British Muslims or Muslims in general are not Muslims, right? Which is the part of the process, part of the problem here, is that we need people who are from that community to stand up and actually afford them that space. And finally, I want to end on this point. When we leave today, I want us to try and start thinking from a different perspective, which is we shouldn't solely rely our sense of belonging on the spaces that are provided to us, or the spaces that are provided for us, or the spaces that are available even. I would push further and say we need to go out there and create these spaces, right? It's enough about thinking about where are these spaces. Go out and create. That is the biggest form of change that we can have, is that we think innovatively. We think about creating these spaces and building those alliances together to affect real and true form of sense of belonging. Thank you very much.
So up next we have Roberto Zurbano, who is here from Cuba today. Roberto Zurbano's career began in the field of literary criticism, and from there went on to support the Cuban hip-hop movement, which eventually evolved into his current work as a Cuban social activist. Zurbano was the fall 2013 scholar and writer in residence of the Connecticut College Center for Comparative Study of Race and Ethnicity. His articles and essays have received international criticism and acclaim and have appeared in literary magazines, journals, and media worldwide. In his writings, Zurbano provides insight into new ideas he proposes for the regional articulation of Afro-descendants in Cuba via an anti-racist organization founded in Cuba 2012 in collaboration with Afro-descendant leaders from throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. He is a member of the Club del Espandru, the Fro Club. I'm sorry, my pronunciation is completely off there. Roberto will have a translator today that will be speaking on his behalf as well. Yeah, translating to Roberto. So they'll speak together. So it will transition between Roberto and his translator. And your name is? Sorry? Catherine. Okay, thank you so much. So we will take it over to Roberto and hear from him.
Vengo de Cuba.
I have come to you from Cuba,
Un país todavía socialista,
a country that is still socialist,
donde el racismo se da en un contexto diferente.
where racism happens in a different way.
Se da como herencia, como legado,
It's a heritage, part of our legacy,
como una renovación muy sofisticada de ese legado esclavista.
and it exists as a pernicious, sophisticated, but undying inheritance from our history of enslavement.
En el proyecto socialista no es importante la categoría raza,
In the socialist project, the category of race was not so important.
es más importante la categoría clase.
It was more important, or seen as more important, to focus on the issues of class.
No me gusta leer,
Okay.
pero aquí voy a leer
I don't generally like to read straight from a text, but I will do so today
para respetar el tiempo de todos nosotros.
to respect the time, your time.
Descubriendo capitales ocultos.
So what I'm going to read, what I wrote is called Discovering Our Hidden Capital.
Para mí, el racismo es como un animal que se ha criado y crece contigo.
For me, racism is like an animal that has grown up with you.
Y crece contigo, expresando su rabia y quizás contaminándote.
Expressing its rage and contaminating you.
El racismo es muy estructurado en términos materiales y económicos.
Racism is very structural in material and economic terms.
Pero a mí me interesa más su estructura invisible y simbólica.
But I am more interested in looking at its invisible and symbolic structure.
O sea, ese mismo animal ya muerto
That same animal, dead,
que regresa como un fantasma,
that comes back as a ghost
vive dentro de ti
and lives inside you
y hay que exorcizar.
and must be exorcised.
Pues cuando camina contigo no te deja ver la ciudad como un espacio propio.
Because when it lives inside you, it doesn't let you see the city as your own space,
Sino como el lugar de otros al que debes mirar con distancia.
but rather the place of others that you must look at with distance.
Yo me siento libre en La Habana cuando reconozco sus fantasmas y herencias racistas.
I feel free in Havana when I recognize the racist ghosts and heritage.
Cuando escucho en los muros de la ciudad los lamentos y los cantos negros.
When I hear in the walls of the city black laments and black songs.
Entonces comienzo a celebrar su historia oculta.
Only then can I begin to celebrate our hidden history.
¿Cómo intervengo en el blanqueado campo del turismo habanero?
So, how do I intervene in this whitened field of Havana tourism?
Pues me he convertido en un antiguía.
I turn myself into an anti-guide.
Hago un Afrocentric Tour
I do an Afrocentric tour
que se llama La Habana Invisible
called Invisible Havana,
y muestro a cubanos, extranjeros, estudiantes y turistas
and I show to Cubans and to foreigners, students and tourists,
una africanía que las guías de turismos silencian.
an Africanness that tour guides tend to silence.
Les pido a esas personas que observen y no hagan selfies ni grabaciones.
I ask those people to observe, not take selfies, nor recordings,
Sino que aprendan a mirar lo que es invisible a los ojos,
but learn to see that which is invisible to the eyes,
pero no es invisible al corazón ni a la historia.
but not invisible to the heart nor to history.
Que miren dónde estaban los negros hace 3 siglos y dónde están hoy.
To look at where black people were 3 centuries ago and where we are today.
Les muestro una gran catedral construida por un maestro de obras negras.
I show them a huge cathedral that was constructed by a black master builder.
Siento el olor que ofrecían las cocineras negras.
I evoke the odors and smells created by the black cook women.
Me detengo en la esquina donde nuestras tatarabuelas vendían la leche de sus senos para las familias blancas.
I stop in the corner where our great-grandmothers sold their breast milk to white families.
Voy donde otras muchachas negras se prostituían.
I go to the corner where other black women prostituted.
o iban a bailar con jóvenes blancos en las fiestas nocturnas donde tocaban los músicos negros.
or went to dance with young white men in nocturnal parties musicalized by black musicians.
También vamos a un mural
We also go to a mural
donde aparecen 80 grandes personalidades del siglo XX cubano.
of 80 personalities from the 19th century,
Hay solo 2 personas negras.
where there are only 2 black faces.
En un extremo está el violinista Brindis de Salas
On one corner, the violinist Brindi de Salas
y el poeta esclavo Juan Francisco Manzano.
and the enslaved poet Juan Manzano.
Luego les llevo al mercado donde se vendieron miles de esclavizados.
Then I take them to the market where thousands of enslaved people were sold.
En ninguno de estos lugares aparece una placa que recuerde el horror de la esclavitud.
But in none of these places is there a physical commemoration.
Y estos son los mismos lugares donde hoy se reproducen exclusiones, silencio y discriminación.
And these are the same places where today exclusion, silence, and discriminations happen.
El turismo del siglo XXI se sostiene sutilmente sobre la estructura del sistema de plantación colonial.
Tourism of the 21st century is sustained subtly on the same structure of the colonial plantation system,
Que rechaza todo lo que es diferente, crítico o emancipatorio.
which rejects all that is different, critical, or emancipatory.
Quizás por eso me detengo mucho más tiempo frente a la única placa sobre la memoria negra en La Habana Vieja.
Which is why I stopped for the longest time in front of the only physical commemoration of black history in Old Havana,
Que recuerda la masacre de 3.000 miembros del Partido Independiente de Color en el verano de 1912.
which remembers the massacre of 3,000 members of the Black Independence Party of Color.
Es decir, le muestro al turista una ciudad que niega, que oculta su huella negra y cimarrona.
That happened in 1912, excuse me. That is to say, I show them a city that hides its black and maroon history.
Pero es una ciudad que también nos pertenece como espacio de resistencia y de dignificación.
But it is a city that also belongs to us as a space of resistance and dignification.
¿Cuánto crecería la autoestima de nuestra gente negra si llegaran a conocer su contribución a la historia de la ciudad?
How much would the self-esteem of our black people grow if they were able to really know the history of... ¿Terminaste la frase?
Sí, la historia de la ciudad.
If they knew the true history of our city,
Nos sentiríamos más orgullosos y aprenderíamos más.
we would feel more proud and we would know so much more.
Después de 20 años de activismo antirracista,
After 20 years of anti-racist activism,
incomprensiones y confrontaciones
misunderstandings and confrontation,
que a veces reproducen lógicas coloniales,
which sometimes reproduce colonial logic,
aprendí que es más inteligente crear pequeñas estrategias y tácticas para exorcizar el fantasma del racismo.
I learned that it's more intelligent to create small strategies and tactics to exorcise the ghosts of racism.
Por eso hace 3 años creamos 4 amigos y yo el Club del Espendrú.
For this reason, 4 activist friends and myself created El Club del Espendrú. It's the Afro Club,
Una abogada afrofeminista,
an Afro-feminist lawyer,
un antropólogo,
an anthropologist,
2 raperos, aquí está Magia del grupo Obsesión,
2 rappers, and one of them is here, Mahia, from the group called Obsesión,
y yo,
and myself,
para enfocarnos en luchas más comprometidas con la vida cotidiana de nuestra gente.
to focus our struggle in committed ways to issues arising from the daily life of our people.
Y hemos estado creando micropolíticas raciales.
So we're creating micropolitics, black micropolitics,
A través de toda la ciudad.
all throughout the city.
Por ejemplo, sobre el impacto del turismo en la población afrocubana,
For example, on the impact of tourism on the Afro-Cuban population,
la falta de muñecas negras para los niños y las niñas,
the lack of black dolls for youth,
y encontrando formas más sencillas y prácticas de organizar nuestra gente.
and looking for more simple and direct ways to organize our people.
Ocuparnos de nuestras necesidades más básicas,
And taking on the most basic needs of our people,
pero con metas y aspiraciones realmente transformadoras.
but always with goals and aspirations that are transformative.
El club ha crecido en la medida que pensamos y trabajamos en colectivo.
The club and myself, we grow together to the extent that we think and work as a collective
Para grupos y personas muy específicas.
for specific groups and people.
Y junto a ellas nos reconocemos como parte de una familia
And together with them, we recognize ourselves as a family.
que vivimos experiencias cotidianas
We live daily life together,
que nos hacen más creativos
daily experiences
y nos
that
fortalecen
make us more creative and strengthen us
frente a las exclusiones y las carencias.
in the face of exclusions and shortages.
Ante la sutil gentrificación que hoy marca la ciudad de
In
La Habana,
this context of subtle gentrification that today defines the city of Havana,
es difícil encontrar espacios propios como los que ya tienen los descendientes de españoles, judíos, ingleses y otros en Cuba.
it's difficult to find our own spaces, such as those now belonging to the descendants of Spaniards, to the Cubans of Spanish, Jewish, Asian, and British descent.
En 1960 se cerraron todos los clubes y sociedades negras.
In 1960, the black clubs and societies were closed across the country.
Sin embargo, las de otros descendientes han logrado sobrevivir hasta hoy.
But those of other groups survived until today.
La población negra no tiene espacios propios.
The black community no longer has autonomous spaces.
Los que quedan son muy caros
Those left are very expensive
o habría que invertir mucho en repararlos.
or would require a lot of investment to repair.
Aún así, el club aspira a tener su propio espacio,
Nonetheless, us, the Afro Club, aspire to have our own physical space,
donde crear un espacio de resistencia fijo, visible.
which would be a permanent site of resistance, visible resistance.
El turismo es un espacio de riesgo porque usa estrategias invasivas.
Tourism is a risky space because it uses invasive strategies.
Invaden el cuerpo de la ciudad con falsos íconos de éxito.
It invades this body of the city with false icons of success
Y estereotipos sin identidad.
and stereotypes without identity.
La Habana últimamente se ha llenado de estatuas de personajes europeos.
Havana is full of statues of European personalities,
Lady Di, Shakespeare, anyway.
Lady Di, Shakespeare, etc.
De negocios diseñados por las remesas culturales de Miami.
And the businesses are designed based on the cultural remittances from Miami,
Que no solo son monetarias, sino ideológicamente excluyentes y racializadas.
which are not only monetary, but also ideologically exclusionary and racialized.
Con esta claridad estamos trabajando, el club también trabaja con los emprendedores negros en Cuba.
So with this clarity, the club, the Afro Club, work with black business people and entrepreneurs, small business people and entrepreneurs in Cuba.
Porque su capital no proviene de remesas,
Their capital does not come from family remittances,
sino de un gran esfuerzo personal y familiar.
but a very hard-won, personally and family, hard-won resources
para insertarse en un mercado que todavía es muy poco diverso.
to then try to insert themselves in a market that is still very not diverse.
Y ellos tienen mayor conciencia de su responsabilidad social.
And they have greater consciousness of their social responsibility.
El turismo oculta el rostro negro de la ciudad,
But tourism hides the black face of the city,
pero usa las músicas, las religiones y los cuerpos negros para lucrar.
but it uses black musicians, black religion, and black bodies to generate profit.
Y esa es la colonialidad que rechaza el Club del Esplendor.
This is the coloniality that the Afro Club rejects.
Atravesamos toda la ciudad celebrando los valores afrodescendientes.
We work all over the city celebrating African values,
Como valores que contribuyen a negros, mestizos y blancos.
which are values that are meaningful and contribute to black people, brown people, and white people.
Pues los valores afro son universales, benefician a toda la humanidad.
Because African values are universal and they benefit all of humanity.
Nuestras intervenciones urbanas estimulan una participación consciente,
Our urban interventions stimulate a conscious participation,
pero también mucho sentido de la alegría.
but they also stimulate a sense of joy.
Bailamos, nos hacemos juegos entre nosotros,
We dance, we have festive games.
estimulamos la dignidad y también la autoestima.
We also stimulate dignity and self-esteem
De la gente muy anciana y de los niños también.
with elders and also with children.
La gente participa porque reconoce nuestra intención de incorporar elementos tan cercanos como la memoria familiar,
People come to us, or we're able to bring people together because we're working with such close and intimate issues as family memory,
el pelo afro,
African hair,
los juegos infantiles,
children games,
las muñecas negras.
black dolls.
No hay en la industria ni en las tiendas, pero podemos construirlas.
There is no industry that makes black dolls, but we make them ourselves.
Hay un grupo de muñequeras que han dejado de hacer esas muñecas feas que hacían para el turismo, para hacer muñecas más bellas, más parecido a nosotros.
We have organized a group of doll makers who have stopped making those ugly tourist dolls to make beautiful dolls that look like us.
Entrenamos a un grupo de gente joven,
We have trained a group of young people,
enseñándole la historia social del negro en Cuba que no le enseñan en las universidades.
teaching them the black social history of Cuba that they're not learning at the university.
Nos reunimos en unas tertulias con los ancianos.
We come together with lectures and workshops with our elders.
La mamá de Magia es una de las organizadoras de esas tertulias.
Mahia's mother is one of the main organizers of those lectures and workshops.
Una señora con muchos secretos.
She has many secrets.
Ya. Hacemos talleres para hablar de experiencias discriminatorias.
We do workshops to share and talk about our own experiences of discrimination.
No solo racistas, también homofóbicas, sexistas, etc.
Not only racist discrimination, but also sexist and homophobic discrimination.
O sea, nuestra contribución son ejercicios de crecimiento, de orgullo, de resistencia.
These are experiences of growth, of pride, and of resistance.
Porque son ejercicios de pertenencia.
They are exercises of belonging.
Exercise of belonging of our black community, que tiene grandes capitales.
And to show ourselves that our black community has many kinds of our own capital.
Nuestros capitales son la memoria,
Our capital is memory,
la alegría,
joy,
el cimarronaje,
cimarronaje, which is the maroon
La au-
tradition,
la auto-
slave resistance, slave uprising,
la autoestima,
self-esteem,
y la esperanza.
and hope.
Y aunque mucha gente negra nuestra todavía se cree muy pobre,
And although many of our people still feel they are poor,
la estrategia del Club del Espendrú
our strategy at the Club del Espendrú
es compartir créditos e intereses de esos capitales
is to share credits and interest of our capital
con la gente que más lo necesita
with those who most need it,
y celebrar juntos valores que nadie puede arrebatarnos.
and to celebrate together those values that no one can take from us,
Que solo podemos compartir con aquellos otros que Fran Fanon llamó los condenados de la tierra.
they can better be shared with those people that Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. I think our panelists have provided us with such a diversity in perspectives, coming from a range of positions and working on such an important topic from very different fields. So I hope that you've been able to enjoy that balance and that diversity in our panel. We did have time, so we had allocated some time for a roundtable discussion where I was going to present some questions, but I would prefer to use the remaining time of this session to allow you to engage with our panelists and ask questions that you have. Given the noise issue that we have experienced next door, with the highly interactive format of their panel, I might have to get you to maybe write questions and bring them up, or if you're willing to scream out really loud. Okay, if you can scream really loud, I might have to repeat your question to the panel so that we can have the mic kind of roaming between the panelists. So we will have 20 minutes or so to engage in this Q&A. Can I just get you in the next minute, if you have not installed the app for the conference, can you please install the app and evaluate this session? So this is one of the first years where we've looked at this topic and this theme. And if we want to engage in this theme again, we need to hear your feedback. We need to hear what you think, what we should improve. So please make your evaluation under ratings and reviews as detailed as possible so that we can take it into account for next year. I would love for this to happen again and bring in some more perspective. So if you think that this was important, please review the session. I'll remind you at the end as well. So in the meantime, please install the app and think of your questions. And if you are ready to go, please put your hand up. So I think we still have 20 minutes. So these are the numbers of questions. Does anyone else have a question that they might ask later on so I can pace it? Okay, good. I think we can manage this. All right, perfect. I'm going to start here at the front.
Thank you all so much. It's very inspirational. I'm an artist and professor of social work and hammer in all the time how important space is, and have done a lot of work in public space using art as a way to bring together people of different backgrounds, different perspectives who have a shared interest. And so many of what you guys have talked about makes me think of some of the power that art has to, maybe we can't reclaim those physical spaces, but to commemorate and to pay tribute to memory and history and hopes and dreams. Maybe some of you have heard of the work of Candy Chang, but how we can use what exists to use art in a way to manifest what many of you have talked about from these different lenses and perspectives. And so I'd be interested to hear what you think about the merger of art into some of the work that you're doing, or maybe the potential of it. So that's my question.
Did anyone want to comment on this in particular?
Yeah, I'll say a few words. So I think if we've all heard of Joseph Nye, American academic, coined the term soft power. And that was born out of a very militaristic nature and history of what that meant, which was effectively winning the hearts and minds. I have issue with that because hearts and minds are not lost for them to be won. On the contrary, hearts and minds need to be softened. So my sort of school of thought is about softening hearts and minds. Because it becomes, again, a relationship of having your heart hardened and softened through, again, the media that we watch or the perception that we are fed in on a daily basis, both consciously and unconsciously. And for me, art is a form of soft power. And the way art, music, food, sport, all are forms of soft power, where they are able to affect that change or disseminate information. So it's a tool to disseminate that sort of rhetoric or narrative which you want to push out. And what's very interesting is with art, it's universal. With sport, universal. Food, etc. All of these things are universal. And Pierre Bourdieu, a French philosopher, again, you'll see that I have a knack for French philosophers when it comes to this. But they've written extensively on this issue. So with Pierre Bourdieu, he talked about social capital, and this is something which the previous speaker spoke about, we're focusing a lot on the agency that we have as individuals and as a collective when it comes to capital. And it's very interesting that we've seen with CAP, we've seen with other, Muhammad Ali, for example, an excellent example. You've got others who are in the, public personalities who use their agency, i.e. their capital, to effect change, right? With all due respect, whether we like it or not, all of us here, if we sat in front of a national TV channel and we said the same words the likes of LeBron James would say, it won't be as effective, right? Because the capital is far more in LeBron James's favor, for example, yeah? And that is something which is quite normal. So for me, what's interesting is when we reach that potential of capital, or that bank of capital, which reaches to a certain point, we're able to convert that into transformative change, right? Into changing perceptions, into having that art piece or whatever it may be, to transform into soft power, to impose recognition, right? We need to actually first and foremost build on that agency and capital. And I think all of us in this room have that agency, have that potential to unlock that capital within us. Right? And it's about unearthing that and actually unlocking that potential, which gives us the opportunity to transform art into a form of soft power like many others to bridge that communication gap.
Did any other panelists want to comment on that question? Perhaps Roberto?
Hace más de 20 años que yo trabajo con grupos de rap en La Habana.
So for more than 20 years, I've been working with this hip-hop group in Havana.
Y en los años 90, el hip hop fue la vanguardia antirracista en Cuba.
In the 1990s, the hip-hop movement was the vanguard of anti-racist work in Havana.
Y creo que hubo una transformación sobre este fenómeno, una visibilidad del racismo en un contexto socialista.
And there was a new visibility to the unsolved problem of racism thanks to the hip-hop movement.
En los espacios del hip hop, en los espacios donde se hacían competencias de b-boy y b-girls.
So in the hip-hop spaces and where there were competitions between b-boys and b-girls,
Allí donde llegaban algunos graffiti,
and some elements of graffiti,
esos se convirtieron en espacios de resistencia,
were also sites of resistance,
de crítica,
of criticism,
de lucha,
and struggle.
y se fueron ampliando por la ciudad.
And they were then spread out through the city.
Fue un buen momento que luego fuimos perdiendo,
It was a really important moment, a good moment that we sort of started to lose.
porque también a los artistas a veces tratan de comprar o silenciar.
Because there are forces that try to buy or silence artists.
Hoy nos quedan muy pocos grupos de raperos de conciencia.
There are very few groups of conscious rap,
Pero los pocos que quedan son activistas muy importantes.
but those few that have stayed, that are left, are very important activists.
Y el grupo Obsesión, por ejemplo, tiene una pedagogía para trabajar con niños, ir por las cárceles.
And the group called Obsesión, for example, has developed a pedagogy. They work with children, with elders, and with incarcerated folks.
Bueno, de eso ya va a hablar mañana a las 11 de la mañana.
But Mahia will talk more about that tomorrow at 11.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Are we able to go on to the next question? Did anyone else want to contribute? Okay, perfect. Yes, over there. You look very keen, eager. Yes. Yes, please. Oh yeah, we got the mic coming over. No, we have the mic coming over just for recording purposes, so I had overseen that. I'm sorry.
Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for your panel. Like, I personally am really inspired by seeing like all of the intersectionality that's here just at this conference. And like, I'm involved. My name is Shreya, and I'm the current vice president of the ASUCD. That's the Associated Students of the University of California, Davis. And as an activist in an academic space, I guess like my question is, how do you, with the high rate of turnover of students, you know, we have new students coming in every 4 years, and like there's new activist voices, how do we start like reclaiming the spaces of the academic institution and like directly questioning those people that have been oppressive towards its students and starting to like go about reclaiming that space?
Excellent.
I think it's actually an easy question. So, historically, there's been attempts to reclaim academic spaces through ethnic studies, where campuses were community spaces. It wasn't just about a bunch of elitist academics teaching and then bringing that out to the community, where the campus itself was centered around the community and the needs and concerns of the community. That has shifted drastically over several years now, but that's still something to strive for, right? I think what's happening on campuses, and it's by design, is a siloing of student activism and organizing so that it's separate from the actual community right outside the campus doors, so the city itself that the universities are even couched in, like Davis as an example, or Berkeley or San Francisco or Ivy League schools around the country, but also a siloing against each other. So each campus has its own, its own ways in which the infrastructure of the campus has been designed to repress student activism. We know that for a fact. We know that that's been documented, right? And UC Davis is not exempt from that. So if we can figure out a way to reclaim those spaces and actually open up and permeate the campus borders and boundaries to include the actual communities, the working class communities in the neighborhoods around us, that will shift the conditions. We can't actually depend on the university administrations or the infrastructures on campus to do that for us. We must demand it of them, and we must give them no other choice but to be able to actually work in community with different neighborhoods around us, but also across the country and around the world, as campuses used to be back in the day. We know that internationalism was one of the strongest values of campus organizing historically, and that's been stripped away because it's a threat to those in power. So if we understand it as such, then we must recommit ourselves to bringing that back into universities.
Thank you very much. And one of the issues in Australian universities, of course, is with student turnover, activism fades and flourishes according to the circumstances of the day, the political circumstances, and also just which students are around. What we did at Western Sydney University, and we've done it for other universities, is do bystander anti-racism training for all faculty and for professional staff or administrators. And with some virtuous effects we've been able to determine as well. And also making very clear messages with signage and posters that the campus does not tolerate racism and other forms of intolerance. What we have also found, though, is that if you set those circumstances and conditions, that the student activism is also then empowered as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So just very quickly to add to that, the British experience. Noam Chomsky, he said something very interesting about students graduating out of university with a large bill to pay, right? And actually that is part of the structure of how to destroy creativity, right? And so that's first thing, is that we need to acknowledge the fact that these universities in their very own existence, in their very own physicality are there. They are part of the problem in the sense that you've got this massive student activism happening during their first, second, third years. As soon as they graduate, yeah, I'm not really interested because I have $100,000 to pay off. You know, that's the reality, right? The second thing is, I come from an institution called SOAS University of London, founded in 1916. For those who know, it's called the School of Oriental and African Studies. It was founded by the Foreign Commonwealth Office, and the premise of this institution was to send agents who were working from the Ministry of Defense as well as the Foreign Office and spies to basically go, learn languages from the Orient, from Africa, and then be sent out to the field to go and spy, and then come back. And obviously, we had back then the Ministry of Information, which was fed into the idea that any information gathered could be converted into intelligence. And quite interestingly enough, the slogan of SOAS is knowledge is power. Now, the struggle there is decolonizing the studies, the subjects that we are very much part of and studying. One of my greatest passions is in international diplomacy. When I lecture, I deliberately focus on case studies which are beyond the sort of norms that we follow, and looking at actually try to contest and push the students to actually think beyond what is the cultural norm or what is the academic norm when we look at ex-author who knows a couple of sentences in the Arabic but really doesn't really understand the demographic of the region, but then comes back and suddenly is a professor and teaching about, you know, someone who is from the region and actually is a first generation coming from the Middle East and actually being taught about their own culture. And it's like, hold on a second, you know, what credentials do you have apart from a degree that you put up on your wall? So I think it's very, very important that we acknowledge that there's a structural issue as well as also in campus itself, whether there is rigidity or the ability to be flexible and actually change to afford that culture of activism, culture of change, right, that you need to have. And obviously begins with the mind, and hence why when we're teaching the next generation, you know, there's this term that we often reflect on is the mind of a child is where the revolution begins, right? And that's where the thought process and the creative thinking begins from. So yeah, just wanted to, and actually there's something called is it CVE, which is similar to what we have in Britain called the PREVENT program. And it's very interesting that students are actually treated as suspects before they're treated as actual citizens. This is a grave concern here. When we're talking about freedom of expression, we're talking about these liberal values which are unfortunately inconsistent in their applicability and obviously being applied across the UK in various universities on and off campus. If we're truly going to be talking about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, then we need to allow these voices to be invited onto campus, who actually very much in their own right will address and will tackle institutions and will tackle the very structures that we're part of. Because the moment we are turning students who are going to be the next generation of leaders of our communities and our society into suspects, this is the gravest problem that we have in causing mistrust and distrust in our communities. And what we need to do is, we talk about short bridging and long bridging. You know, a lot of the institutions, you know, I would say in this country, in terms of the PREVENT program, the equivalent in this country here with the CVE, is actually enforcing that trust and that confidence that we have in our students as well.
Yo también quería decir que los estudiantes que se van no lo perdemos, sino lo ganan otros espacios.
I'd also like to say that often the students that leave the university, like we don't lose them, they are, other spaces gain them.
Y hay que enseñarle a los estudiantes que leer muchos libros no los hace activistas.
But one of the important things we need to do is also make sure students know that reading a lot of books doesn't make you an activist.
He tenido muchos estudiantes que pueden citarme de memoria 20 autores y 20 libros feministas.
I've had students, for example, who can cite 20 authors from 20 very important books on feminism.
Eso no es ser activista.
But that doesn't make them a feminist activist.
Eso es tener una buena biblioteca. Eso es tener una buena biblioteca.
That is just a sign of having a good library.
El activismo es un ejercicio cívico de diálogo.
Activism is a civic exercise of dialogue.
Hay que recordar que muchos activistas no saben leer ni escribir.
And many important activists never learned how to read or write.
Es algo más que tiene que ver con el otro o con la otredad o con el othering.
It's an action it's something far beyond that reading and writing. It's an action that has to do with othering and belonging.
I think that was a great closing statement. I am really sorry for those who had their hands up and weren't able to get their questions answered. It took a lot longer than I had anticipated. But I am very grateful for your being here. Thank you so much for attending this session. Again, if you can please evaluate the session on the app. I know that some people have experienced issues with the app itself. So if you do, let me know. But thank you so much, and we will see you throughout the rest of the conference. Thank you for being here, and I hope to meet you all over the next day as well.
Thank you for coming.